Davo here from the Axiom Body Piercing Studio in Des Moines, Iowa. And coming up next, piercing infants, toddlers, and small children, and why I don't suggest doing that. Going to go through some of the things that you need to consider before doing that, and give you kind of more of an education on the subject. So stick around. For those that don't know me, my name is Davo. I'm a professional body piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing Studio here in Des Moines and share my space with Skin Kitchen Tattoo. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this subject from an expert level. Yes, I'm an expert. I know things. So let's put on the expert cap and talk about why I don't suggest doing them. There's a number of reasons. I know that some of you are trying to find a healthier way to do it, a safer way to do it, than going to the mall and getting it done with an ear piercing device or your local hair salon. That's understandable, and I applaud you for trying to look out for the most healthy and safe way to get it done. Nothing replaces having a professional piercer do it, not only because of their understanding of anatomy and how piercings heal, but also their ability to do the piercing with sterile equipment and their knowledge about cross-contamination and being able to eliminate, if not completely, at least limit the possibility of an infection happening during the piercing procedure itself, and also help you with any problems that may arise after the piercing is done during the healing process. So let's go into why I don't suggest doing it. If you go to a professional piercer, I think maybe I need to explain how it's done. We usually insert a hypodermic needle, or piercing needle, that is the same thickness as the jewelry thickness, into the area, making a crescent moon incision, and then we slide jewelry in behind it. Keep in mind that you're talking about a child. Is a child going to sit perfectly still while I inject, though it is very quick and not really that painful, a needle through their tissue, through their lobe, then allow me time to insert the jewelry in? The problem is that most kids will not sit still. Think back to the last time that you took them in for shots, or a haircut, or brush their teeth, or clip their nails, and how they reacted to that. Did they sit still, or did they freak out? Kids have a big imagination. They're very energetic. Sometimes their fantasies are more powerful than what's really happening around them. And a couple things, they don't have that pain experience for them to know, hey, this isn't something I need to fear. This isn't a dangerous type of pain that I'm experiencing. I'm going to live through this, opposed to this is going to kill me and I need to go into fight or flight. The other issue with it is usually they'll let me do one and then they want absolutely nothing to do with me after I've done the first one. So if you're wanting a set done, that ain't probably going to happen. My biggest concern is my health and their health. And the reason why is if they're unwilling or unable to move or to sit still during the process, that I might puncture myself with that needle after I do the piercing. I'm pretty good at keeping my hands out of the way, but every once in a while, if you have somebody jostling around a lot, they're either going to do damage to possibly the side of their neck, or there's always the possibility that they shift or move during the piercing, and I end up puncturing maybe my index finger, and then I've got a boo-boo. And the problem with that is that even though I test myself or get tested on a regular basis, and I'm healthy and free of any really heavy viruses that you should be concerned about, I'm not the same person as your child. I have an entire different little system of probiotics, microorganisms, and other things that live on the surface of my skin and also in my bloodstream. When that transfers to another person, that can cause, at the least, an infection as your body tries to fight off the foreign pathogens, which is what, your germs, basically. Same thing for me. There's a possibility it's going to become infected. And it may require medical treatment. Worst case scenario is that you go to a piercer who's notorious for getting needle strikes, has done numerous clients that have hepatitis or HIV even, and they have contracted that, and then they transfer that to your child. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. That's the first reason. That's a big reason why I don't suggest doing it. Then, after the piercing is done, we start inserting the jewelry. The way we do that is we usually push the jewelry in while pushing the needle out. They have to stay in contact. Sometimes we'll use taper pins, sometimes we'll use guide pins that kind of sit inside the jewelry, make it a little bit easier. However, even in those situations, if the child moves during that process, they can break that connection, and we won't be able to get the jewelry in. Which means one of two things will happen. We'll either have to use a taper pen or something to guide, to kind of refine those two holes and then guide the jewelry through, or it will have to be re-pierced at some point. Both of those things are not going to be comfortable, they're not going to feel good, and they're probably going to be painful. More painful than they would be if we just simply did it and get the jewelry in. So those are the two things during the process. Afterwards, my biggest concern is aftercare. Is keeping your child motivated and constrained and having that discipline not to handle the jewelry during the healing process. Even adults, we tend to be drawn to anything on our body that is different, new, or unusual, especially if there's pain attributed to it. It's a kind of an instinct to want to feel it, to make sure that it is not something we need to be concerned about and need attention. Children, unlike adults, well, most adults, because I know there's a few of you out there that do this, tend to explore their entire environment with their hands and their mouths. Even when they touch things with their hands, they tend to taste their fingers afterwards. If you take into account that and then multiply it by the situation that your child sees himself in or herself in on a regular basis, in preschool or kindergarten or elementary school, and on the playground where basically there's hundreds of other kids exploring everything with their hands and their mouths and blowing snot on things and everything else, you begin to understand that these areas are not very clean, and chances are is your child is going to come in contact with those and possibly transfer that to one of the piercings or both the piercings and end up with an infection. Not fun. Infection's bad. Infection bad. So that, short of putting a cone around their neck like a child, like a dog that just came from the vet, or a cat, I don't know how you would keep them from doing it. The other thing is they have to sit still and do soaks for 10 minutes twice daily. Are they going to sit still for 10 minutes with the piercing submerged or with hot compresses? Also, are they going to allow you to take a look at it and clean the piercing regularly? Or are they going to be one of those children that even if they see a bath or hear the word bath or see water, freak out about it? So those things all have to be considered. It is going to be an open wound for a minimum of 8 to 12 weeks, which means that it is acceptable to infection and precautions have to be taken. A 5-year-old is probably not going to possess the experience or the knowledge or the discipline to follow that strict regimen. So that's one of the other reasons why I don't suggest doing it. Some other things to consider, and then we'll get to ear piercing devices. The other concern is rejection or migration during the healing process. The piercing may not reject entirely, but it will probably migrate. Our bodies grow drastically between the ages of 0 and 18, even some people 20, 22. The lobe can increase in size roughly about 3 to 4 times the size it is as an infant. If you pierce it and it looks dead center at that point in time, what will happen is as the lobe grows, which is usually outward, the piercing stays stationary. So even though it looks dead center when they're a child, by the time they reach adulthood, it's going to be all the way down to the bottom or off center or off to the back or way to the front and probably need to be re-pierced. One final thing on that before I move on to some other things. A lot of people have this conception that it's just an ear piercing. It's just a piercing. If it doesn't work out, you just take the jewelry out, everything goes back to normal. The problem with that is we don't really take into account how permanent scar tissue is. You're only given one set of lobes. You're not going to get a second one. You're not going to regenerate any new ones. These are the ones that you get. Anytime you pierce the body and try to heal out a piercing, you are creating scar tissue that is going to be with you until they plant you in the grave. So you are permanently altering your child. Regardless of how you're having it done, regardless of what jewelry you put in it, you are permanently altering them. Well, another thing with children that you want to consider is if they're involved in any type of sport activity, competitive hobbies of any sort or activity, especially if there's a national governing board over it, they're going to probably require them to remove the jewelry while they're competing. Even though the piercing may take anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks to heal, that is only the first stage. Removing the jewelry for any extended period of time, in some cases even an hour or two, will cause the piercing to start shrinking and closing. So when you try to put jewelry back in there, you tend to dislodge and reopen the piercing. So it can prolong the healing period, and it can lead to infection because of how clean that jewelry is kept between each time you change it. I know a lot of people believe they have ears that are permanently pierced. The reality is they aren't. If you put the jewelry in after 6 months and it's sore and tender and agitated and there's a tad bit of bleeding, you have re-pierced the ear. Don't believe that it's open that whole time. It will look open on the outside, but on the inside where the tissue has gotten to compact and start to fill in, it is not open. So if your child is involved in activities that they are going to have to remove it for long periods of time throughout the year, within the next 2-3 years, I don't really suggest getting it pierced for that reason. It's going to probably cause problems either initially or eventually down the road. The other thing is a concern that the medical industry has, that by introducing these children to materials such as implant-grade steel, especially with the ear piercing devices where it's really low grade, and various other materials, that we are building are increasing the likelihood that later in life, because of prolonged exposure, they will develop allergies towards them. So that's another thing to consider. Now let's get on to these ear piercing devices. Obviously, I'm not a fan of them. They were developed in the 1970s. Prior to that, most people when they got pierced would either, there were many department stores and salons that would actually hire a certified nurse to come in to do piercings in a sterile environment, or you would go see your doctor to have it done, or, like my mother, needle and potato. Why is it always potatoes? Is potatoes some magic thing? I don't know. When the ear piercing devices came on the market, they were kind of touted as an easy, clean way, safe way to do it. They have a lot of problems. The first thing being is that there's no way to properly sterilize them. And even though the guns themselves may not come in contact with the piercing itself, or even the tissue of the person getting pierced, their skin, the problem is that when you do a piercing, especially without much force, it's going to squirt out blood spray. That will get on the gun and possibly the person that's actually doing the piercing and the person getting pierced, of course. You are basically, in essence, taking a semi-sharp object, a thin piece of wire that has kind of the same consistency as a tack, and you are shooting it through the tissue at a high rate of speed. And that's going to tear through the piercing, causing a lot of trauma to it, and it's also going to cause a lot of blood spray. Since most people that are doing this are not really heavily trained in sterilization, cross-contamination, all these things that we find very important in the body piercing industry, they are probably going to contaminate the gun and everything around it, including other clients. In theory, if somebody came in with, let's say, a very strong virus like hepatitis C, got the piercing done, their ears pierced, and then the next person came in after they swabbed it off with a little bit of alcohol and somehow came in contact with that hepatitis virus, they could get hepatitis. There's been never any documentation or really case studies on this because it'd be kind of hard to prove. Most of the people that have contracted that particular disease usually live pretty risky lives, so whether or not that was from an ear piercing device or some of the other activities they were involved with, it's very hard to prove. But consider that. Like I said earlier with the needle strikes, if you go to a piercer, you're always taking that risk that they have been, that they do have something that your child shouldn't have. And I would hate to have a small child start out their life with hepatitis C. Just saying. And it's not really the people that are doing this' fault. Most of the education that comes to them is either from a retail standpoint, where they have a few minutes of, yeah, don't do this, don't do that, and here's how you put basically they'll just tell them, here's how you load it, you swab off a little bit of alcohol, you mark it with that marker, and then you inject it. They don't really talk about, hey, when you want to wash your hands first, put on a set of gloves, don't touch absolutely anything other than the person and the machine that you're using. They don't go through these things, and they don't know better. So I would suggest anytime you go into any of these places that you immediately wash your hands as soon as you leave it, especially if you're eating anything. I remember sitting on a bench at a mall once. I was waiting on somebody, and I watched this young girl, not more than 17 or 18 years old, do some ear piercings on this small child with her friend. She used some hand sanitizer, and then she put on some latex gloves, and then a customer came up, and she rang up the customer, took the money, handed back the change. The phone rang, she answered the phone, she put that down, then she went over and swabbed off the child's ears, and then somebody else came up and wanted something, and she got something off the wall and handed it to the person, and then rang them up and did all of that. Then she went back and marked the person with a marker she pulled out of some cup in some magical space behind the counter. And then she pulled out this tub, one of those plastic storage tubs, and opened it up and began rummaging through that and pulled out numerous different devices until she found, I guess, the one that she liked or the one that wasn't broken. Then went over and did the piercing, and then picked up a piece of gauze or some type of, I'm sure, alcohol pad, and used that to stop the bleeding. During the whole thing, she never changed her gloves and she never washed her hands, which means every surface that she came in contact with, and every person she came in contact with, and everything she came in contact with went onto the gun that could possibly have gone into the piercing. And it's because she doesn't know better. Then there's the act of the actual piercing. I've kind of gone over this, that it does do a lot of trauma to the piercing. One thing it does in some cases is the back will actually do the piercing opposed to the sharp part. It pushes almost like a paper punch. It does create a lot of trauma. The problem with the jewelry itself is it's usually kind of a one-size-fits-all situation on length, and it's often not long enough to allow for the inflammation that happens from the trauma of the piercing, which is a great deal more than you would see with just a normal ear piercing with a hypodermic needle or a piercing needle. So the piercing will start to expand beyond the length of the jewelry and start impacting. This has caused a lot of problems. I did watch a video once from one of the educators from one of the jewelry manufacturers that sell these things, and he was talking about, well, one of the reasons why ears are so safe is because the tissue is very, it seals up the wound very quickly. The reason why you're not seeing bleeding after it's done with one of these machines is usually because the jewelry is so tight, there's not space for the piercing to bleed properly. This also creates a situation where it can't discharge properly and cause things to fester. If you do get an infection, your body cannot expel the infection the way that it normally heals, and that can cause issues also. Then it comes down to the material of the jewelry itself. It's usually substandard materials, though there are some products that are a little bit better than others. They do tend to do a lot of plated jewelry, which is not a good indication of a piece of jewelry that you should put in your body for any extended period of time, because you never know what the undercoating is, the metal underneath. So that's bad. So that's about all I have to say about the subject. If you feel like I haven't mentioned something or I've said something and you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to discuss it, or contact me through email, or give me a call. I'll talk on the phone. I'm not crazy. You call me, I'm talking. If you like the video, please give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more of these on body piercing education and tattooing and everything that we do here at the channel, please subscribe and give us hit that notification bell so you know that when we do post new videos, and we post 3 to 4 a week usually. Other than that, hope you're having a good day. Hope you learned something. Hope you can make that educated decision in the future, and I will see you, if you're in the area, for your piercing needs in the future.